Assalamu alaikum, I'm your host Maz Patel, and tonight on In Conversation, we're joined by none other than Andrew Feinstein, the Executive Director and Co-founder of Shadow World Investigations, the UK-based NGO he launched in 2019 with fellow investigator Paul Holden. Andrew also stood for elections in the 2024 general election. He's thrust himself into the national spotlight, finishing second to Keir Starmer in Holborn and St Pancras. So, Andrew, thank you so much for joining me today. I've interviewed you before, and it's been a while since I've had you back. I mean, it was in the the throes of the Gaza genocide. We had a really good chat. And if viewers want to see it, it's on our podcast. You can catch it on any of the online portals like YouTube, for example. Since then, a lot's happened. You've become a lot more prominent in terms of your involvement with the British political scene, and I wanted to sort of explore that with you in detail, and also to find out what your views are. Lots happening. Politics certainly has completely transformed since dare I say October 2023. We've had a change of government. We've had so many scandals now. It seems like there's a scandal every other week. Tell us about, however, your work. What have you been doing in the interim?
So obviously after the election, there was a lot of work involving various political processes, particularly locally in Camden. Holborn and St Pancras is where I've always lived in the 25 odd years I've been in the UK. We've established something called the Camden People's Alliance, which is very exciting. It's community driven. There'll be standing candidates in the local elections in May. And then, of course, there have been various national things going on. But from a sort of a Shadow World Investigations perspective, I suppose there are two primary things. The one is my colleague, Paul Holden, who I believe you'll be speaking to in the future, has published an extraordinary book called The Fraud, Keir Starmer, Morgan McSweeney and the Crisis of British Democracy. And I've been travelling around with Paul and others, Alexei Sale, Beth Winter, Jamie Driscoll and others have joined us, talking about the state of Keir Starmer's Labour Party. And both Paul and I do that as constituents of Keir Starmer's, very unhappy constituents, I should say. So that's been a big part of what I've been doing. And then the second part, and arguably the most important thing I've been working on, has been a book that will come out in September of this year called Making a Killing, How the West Profits from Slaughter in Gaza and Yemen. And this is a book that provides a narrative of both the genocide, which in my opinion is ongoing. I think the ceasefire is a PR exercise. This is not what we all understand as a ceasefire. People are being killed every day. But also what we sometimes refer to as the forgotten war in Yemen, where over 10.5 years, hundreds of thousands of people have lost their lives, millions more have suffered enormously. And we identify the sorts of scale of profits that have been made, running into the hundreds of billions, and who has made those profits. And really the intention of that is both to enable people to understand these conflicts, to understand the economic motives that are partially behind the conflicts, but also to look at getting justice for the people of Yemen, the people of Gaza, which takes me back to my own MP, Keir Starmer, because it's not just a matter of, I don't think he should be our Member of Parliament. I don't think he should be Prime Minister. I think he should be in The Hague, because I believe that his government has not just been complicit in a genocide, but has been an active participant in that genocide. And why do I say that? Just one fact. Besides the huge amounts of weaponry that we know Britain has been exporting to Israel, Britain produces 15% of every F-35 jet, and the F-35 jet has been central to the genocide. But Britain has flown more spy flights over Gaza than the Israeli Air Force itself, providing information to the IDF that is likely used for targeting of civilians thereafter. And if we don't address these crimes, if the people who've perpetrated these crimes do not face justice any semblance of the rule of law, both domestically in Britain and internationally, is over, is finished. And we're effectively accepting that we're living in a lawless world where people like Keir Starmer and Donald Trump decide what is legal and what is illegal. And these are two people I would not like to be making those judgments.
So then you presumably agree with what the Canadian Prime Minister, the former Bank of England head,
Mark
Carney, when he said that there's a rupture now. You know, it's about. I mean, he spoke. If you remember, at the Davos summit, he spoke about how. You know, it's about having effectively might is right, so to speak. I think I'll leave it at that. You know, that's what he was speaking about.
Which is almost slightly ironic, because Mark Carney himself, as Prime Minister of Canada, hasn't stopped the flow of weapons to Israel, for instance. No. But what is concerning him is that Canada is being hit by very severe tariffs by the US, and Trump makes threats all the time. I mean, suggesting that Alaska should be part of America, et cetera, like he feels about Greenland, and making all sorts of threatening noises towards Canada. And while I'm extremely glad that Carney spoke out, he should have been speaking out years earlier, because this rupture has been in place since the 7th of October 2023, and we have seen lawlessness, including from Canada. So I'm very glad that somebody amongst Western leaders has spoken out. I question why it didn't happen sooner.
Yes.
And I also question why more are not speaking out post Carney's comments.
But then can I put it to you, Andrew? You mentioned a lot there, but is, for example, Israel, or let's go even, you know, broader and talk about Zionist ambitions, you know, in terms of its ambitions in the Middle East, for example, is that to be seen in isolation? Because many say actually Zionism is an issue across the world, but is it Zionism itself, or is it something more akin to perhaps the global military-industrial complex, of which Zionism is just one part, perhaps, you know, for the Middle East, whereas there are many other regions across the globe which are not affected by Zionism, but are still affected by this, you know, this system that is devouring large parts of the world, Africa and Southeast Asia, for example.
I mean, it's a very interesting point you make, and I think the two things are intertwined. I think what we are seeing is we are seeing an age of inequality, an age of the rise of a small group of billionaires, mainly but not exclusively in the tech sector, who effectively seem to control the world pretty much.
Yes.
You know, we have seen this massive increase in wealth. I mean, Elon Musk today is worth something like ridiculous, trillions and trillions of dollars. In the United Kingdom, to bring it home, we have more billionaires than at any time in the country's history. But we also have more families having to use food banks to survive than at any time since the end of the Second World War. Now, how can these two things live coterminously as they do? You add to that a very interesting recent study which showed that any political opinion expressed by one of these so-called overlords is 44 times more likely to become law than the opinion of any ordinary person. Now, that's an absurdity, because what that means is we all live in the best democracies money can buy, because money is effectively driving any form of democracy. And I think our democracies are in peril, and I think they're dysfunctional at the moment because they are driven by this money.
Yes.
So that's on the one hand, and that is a global phenomenon. You know, in my own country, South Africa, we have a person who used to be a trade unionist, who I knew very well from the 1980s, Cyril Ramaphosa, who then became a billionaire and is now our president. Now, this is the most unequal country on the planet with a billionaire president. Again, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So this is a global phenomenon. At the same time, the impact of Zionism as encapsulated by the State of Israel,
yes,
is attempting to be a more powerful ideological force in our politics than I would argue at any time probably in history since the establishment of the State of Israel. And I want to make one very clear point quickly, and that is that we have to understand Zionism and anti-Zionism as ideologies. Mm-hmm. So this notion that, you know, opposition to Zionism or anti-Zionism or non-Zionism is somehow anti-Semitic is a nonsense. And that nonsense has been intentionally manufactured by the State of Israel to counter the threat of the BDS movement in particular, because as a very, very close ally of apartheid South Africa, when my home country was still a racist apartheid state, they saw how instrumental BDS was in bringing down the apartheid state in South Africa and resulting in democracy in the country. So for them, they've seen what happened to apartheid in South Africa. They are now trying to defend their system of apartheid against those same sorts of forces. And the reality is, even the Jewish community globally is very divided on these questions. You know, there are many, many Jews around the world, including in the United States of America, including in Britain, who self-identify as non-Zionist or anti-Zionist Jews. Now, to Israel and to their supporters, like Keir Starmer, like the German government and many other Western governments, Donald Trump, who, you know, we're talking about such a facile level of analysis there that I'm not sure it's worth going into. But these sorts of people have bought into this Israeli narrative, and they don't treat anti or non-Zionist Jews as Jewish.
Yes.
They're not trying to protect them. And the problem with all of this is that it weaponizes anti-Semitism as a political tool for right-wing political ideologies in the West. And what that does, amongst many other very damaging things, is it undermines the very real struggle against actual anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and all forms of racism and discrimination, because the world is becoming more racist as we speak. So this is a very, very important struggle. And by weaponizing anti-Semitism, by effectively delegitimizing Islamophobia, anti-black racism, etc., you are creating far greater racism in the world. And of course, that gives the space for Israel to continue its genocide in Gaza, with the support of Western governments.
Now, you mentioned in that the proponents of, I'm ad-libbing here, proponents of Zionism are now at their most powerful that we've seen. Maybe there's some way still to go, who knows, right? But at the same time, what we've seen with the demonstrations and the absolute rejection of Israel's genocide, its assault on Gaza, is a rise in those that are opposing this type of this ideology, shall we say, and those that are speaking out against it, the political movements that the countercurrents, effectively, that are going against that rise. So as the power rises, the countercurrents against that power rises as well, and it's manifested in many forms, not just for those that you would typically say would have that view, perhaps on the left, even some of those on the right. For example, if you look at right-wing commentators in America, Tucker Carlson, people who we would never agree with on perhaps 80–90% of his views, because you know, he has some quite strange views, shall we say.
Well, yes.
But on Israel, Candace Owens, on Zionism, they are now absolutely opposed to it, and those voices are rising, and perhaps they're not in power at the moment. You hear more of Lindsey Graham, for example, and because he's very close to those in power. But do you see a moment in the West where these types of figures, not your typical those who are on the left, but these types of figures on the right, for example, actually having the power to effect change and change policy drastically?
Well, where I would have a slight difference with you is I think people like Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, who I agree with your analysis of them entirely, you know, the vast, vast majority of their views I find quite reprehensible.
Yes.
On Israel and on the genocide, I find them very interesting. And And I'm not quite sure of the sort of nature of holding those sorts of views in tandem.
Yes.
But we don't want to psychologize about them at this point, so we'll leave that aside. I think where I slightly disagree with you is I think they do have a lot of power, and I'll tell you how. You know, within the sort of mega moment, if you will, the Make America Great Again movement, which has propelled Donald Trump to power on 2 occasions. These people are very influential.
Yes.
And the other thing, very interestingly, that some of them on what I would describe as the far right tend to talk about now in relation to Trump is Epstein, is Jeff Epstein. And the reality is that Jeff Epstein had very, very close ties to Israel. Low-Key, for instance, has done a very interesting analysis in which he concludes that Epstein was most likely a Mossad asset. Certainly had a lot of contact with Israeli intelligence. Now, these 2 factors, the whole sort of Epstein revelations that continue to come out, plus the opposition of some on the far right to the genocide in Gaza,
yes,
are posing a real political challenge to Trumpism and to his mega movement. And in that sense, I think they're a force for good. And I, of course, would similarly demand that there is total accountability and justice for the victims of Jeff Epstein and all of those very powerful, mainly older white men who took part in his venal activities. And of course, I am a great believer that not only must the genocide end, not only must apartheid in Israel-Palestine end, but there needs to be accountability and justice for the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of people murdered by the state of Israel. And I honestly believe, probably because of my own history in South Africa, that it's in these moments of the greatest darkness.
Yes.
And Gaza has been probably the darkest moment in my almost 62 years on the planet.
Sure.
The little bits of light start to emerge. So I look back to the mid-1980s in South Africa, where the apartheid state seemed militarily, politically, economically unstoppable and incredibly powerful. And soon it was gone. And that came from a period of extreme repression in which the BDS movement globally flourished, in which activism, mainly from trade unions and workers, in a wave of general strikes across the country, increased in intensity and their impact on the economy. And it ultimately led to the end of apartheid. And I honestly believe, and actually a very senior, now retired Israeli former ambassador said this to me, that in the genocide in Gaza lie the seeds of the end of the state of Israel as we know it. And to be honest, the way the state of Israel has behaved, what it has done to Palestinian people, it doesn't deserve to survive in its present form. I believe that the land that is historically Palestine, that like South Africa experienced what we describe as settler colonialism from Europeans coming to that land, believing it was a land without people for a people without land, which is what, you know, the people from Holland and Flanders and France said when they arrived in South Africa, extraordinarily. What we have in South Africa today is one democracy. And I believe that Israel-Palestine can and should be the same. And I believe that the tragedy, the indescribable trauma of Gaza will have been the seeds of that.
Very powerful stuff, Andrew. And obviously, we will be observing and seeing what transpires, because there's a lot of history still yet to be written.
Absolutely.
You mentioned Epstein, and certainly in terms of his impact the release of the files that's had on British politics has been quite extraordinary.
Yeah.
Here we have Peter Mandelson, somebody who was known as a Prince of Darkness in jest, perhaps, but in reality was an incredibly powerful individual. Love him or loathe him, that much nobody could argue with. Yeah. He could make careers, he could break careers, and he was just a phone call away from the most important people on the planet, I suppose. And certainly in British politics, if you were in the Labour movement, or in the Labour Party, shall we say, then his influence was permeating in many places. That's all now come to light. We nearly had, perhaps we may still have, the resignation of Keir Starmer, although some would probably say it's better he stays in there. What's been your reading as an investigative journalist, as a politician as well? You know, you alluded to your time as an MP for the ANC in South Africa. You were with Nelson Mandela. How do you think the Epstein and Mandelson affair will impact politics moving forward? Because it's not always about the here and now, it's also about what happens afterwards.
Absolutely. So Václav Havel, who was a dissident playwright in Czechoslovakia as it then was, after their Velvet Revolution became president. I think he was probably the most surprised person about that in the country. And he wrote about the fact that because of the power and money involved in politics, only the most moral of us should go into politics. But, he said, because of the power and money in politics, it is primarily the least moral amongst us who go into politics.
And that is so true.
If one looks at current political leaders, not just in Britain but around the world, we are talking about a bunch of mediocre, mendacious, often corrupt people. And Peter Mandelson, along with Donald Trump, is probably the poster child of that. I would argue that within the Labour Party, he's probably been the most powerful figure in what I describe as the neoliberal era, so from the late 70s, early 80s. The fact that he is and has been a truly awful human being who has engaged in disgusting behavior at so many different levels, which has now been fully exposed because of his links with Jeffrey Epstein. My hope is that the British public and publics around the world will observe this, will observe all of the Epstein revelations and say, those who currently run our politics are not fit for office. They are not fit to be in public life. And Mandelson is only the most obvious of those. All of those who have supported, been active participants in a genocide, all of those who believe that other human beings only exist to meet their personal needs, whatever those needs might be, should not be in public life, should not be controlling public discourse, as the billionaires who own most of the media in the world now do. This Mandelson moment should be a cleansing moment for Western politics, in which we all say to ourselves, are these the sort of people we honestly want representing us? And if the answer is no, let's represent ourselves. Let's find people from amongst our own communities who we trust to represent us, not in perpetuity, for periods of time. Because I don't believe we should have professional politicians. I believe that if you have a functioning representative democracy, which I don't believe we have in Britain anymore, if you do, it should be people from their local communities who are elected by that community, who are accountable to that community when serving in any form of office, who should be the bedrock of our public life. And we saw in the last election the emergence of an independent movement. And we have 5 MPs, 6 actually now, sitting in Parliament as independents, whereas since 1955, before the last election, we'd had 2 in total. We've seen the rise of a number of different political formations, and I think all of these formations, many of which have had teething troubles, are an attempt to rectify the huge moral gap, the huge moral lacunae, if you will, this huge black hole where morality should be. Because the reality is, I still remember a time when I used to visit this country with my parents, when if a politician lied to Parliament or lied to his or her constituents, that was the end of their political career. Today, it is your ability to lie convincingly and constantly that seems to be a prerequisite for high political office.
Well, on that note, we are going to go to a break, but don't go away, because once we're back, we're going to speak to Andrew more about British politics, certainly his views on Keir Starmer, and also the challenge that the left can put to those in power in this country, and what the best vehicle for that challenge is. Don't go anywhere. See you straight after this. Welcome back to In Conversation, and I've got none other than Andrew Feinstein with me, the very well-known former ANC Member of Parliament, a friend of Nelson Mandela, but now who's somebody who's based in this country and is very much part of the political scene in Britain. On that, Andrew, you stood quite famously against Keir Starmer at the last general elections in 2024. You did enormously, you scored a really good vote, actually, coming second, which was, you know, a testament to the hard work that you and your volunteers and your group put together. But in terms of Keir Starmer himself, he's been in a lot of trouble. We just covered the issues with the Epstein revelations and how he was, you know, he brought his judgment has been called into question. He's been doing a series of U-turns, none more so than just now, where he's gone back on his plans to not have elections in 30 local local borough elections. And it's been a whole series of U-turns. You spoke about mendaciousness, about the ability to lie, the ability to, you know, in terms of how a politician can be measured by their success these days. How do you rate Keir Starmer in terms of how he's done so many U-turns, even when he was pitching to be the Labour leader? And then when he comes into government, he goes back on not just those promises, but the promises that he made in his manifesto. How do you compute all of that in terms of where he is?
Very simple. The least popular British Prime Minister since polling began.
Yes.
You know, he's less popular than Liz Truss, who I don't know if any of your viewers will even remember her, because she was Prime Minister for about 30 seconds, which cost us 70 to 90 billion pounds because of her incompetence. And Keir Starmer is less popular than her. So Keir Starmer has flip-flopped so often that if he was an Olympic gymnast, he'd be covered in gold medals. Unfortunately, as a Prime Minister, he's been an utter and total disaster, which for those of us who've had him as our MP for over 11 years are completely unsurprised by. You know, we've seen he's first of all undemocratic and authoritarian. That's what he's been like in the constituency since day one. He's now imposed that on the country as a whole. We've seen, for instance, the prescription of Palestine action, which has now been overturned by the courts as unlawful. We have seen, as you say, everything he ever said he's gone back on. And why? Well, in Paul Holden's book, The Fraud, he shows that they set out to lie, that they raised huge amounts of donations that they didn't declare.
Yes.
And they used those donations for 2 things. To poll exactly what Labour Party members wanted after Jeremy Corbyn stepped down. And effectively what they wanted was Jeremy Corbyn in a smarter suit and tie, effectively. Someone who the establishment attacked less, but who pretty much had Jeremy's policies, which I would describe as sort of social democratic policies. And that is what they gave, the frame to which they gave to Starmer. He never had any intention of fulfilling one of the pledges that he made. It was simply what Morgan McSweeney told him to say, and the manifesto that Morgan McSweeney wrote. They did the same thing for the 2024 general election. And they knew they weren't going to do a whole lot of things that they spoke about during that election campaign, which has led us in Camden to have the view that the only good thing about our MP is you don't have to guess when he's lying, because every time his lips move, you know he's lying.
But then, Andrew, let me ask you, any reasonable observer would then say, if he doesn't stand for everything that he spoke about for his leadership election or for the general election, what does he stand for? His pitch was that he's the son of a tool maker. He said that so often. You know, he comes from a working class background. When we know it's actually not working class, it was probably lower middle class.
Well, he said his father worked as a tool maker in a factory. His father ran the factory.
And he had a career where he claimed to be a human rights lawyer. I mean, some say, well, it wasn't exactly that. You know, any lawyer can say, perhaps work on a case and say, well, I'm a human rights lawyer. But he was the director of public prosecutions, and there were some very significant missteps when he was the DPP. For example, with the whole decision not to prosecute Jimmy Savile, for example. I mean, a huge issue there. So what does he actually stand for? Has anybody ever worked that out? What was his pitch to those in power? What would he do?
So someone who knew, and unfortunately this person's passed away now, but someone who knew him extremely well throughout his law career, from his training as a lawyer all through his law career, says, I have never seen a human being who has lost any principles, values, or ethics he might have had so quickly when he first got the smell of potential power. Keir Starmer's only objective is power for its own sake, not to do anything with that power, but because of the people who fund and back him. A number of billionaires, including people like Trevor Chin, Gary Lubner, Mark Taylor, a few others, and sort of big corporate backers like Quadrature Capital. What he has done is nothing like he said he was going to. He was going to be a voice for unity in the Labour Party. He has effectively destroyed the left of the Labour Party. And the Labour Party was always this alliance between people who were sort of centrist and people who were varying degrees of left on the political spectrum. Keir Starmer has destroyed that arrangement. He has simply got rid of the left. The irony, of course, being that he has the ability to concoct policy positions on absolutely anything, which everybody across the entire political spectrum is happy to oppose, which is a remarkable skill that I've rarely seen in politics globally. So he has no constituency. He has nobody rooting for him except this tiny group of elite billionaires. And what do they want? They want the end of the left. They want no wealth tax, no form of progressive taxation, because that threatens their wealth. And they want no criticism of Israel. That's basically what they want. And Starmer's delivered on those things. So he's delivered for his backers. He has never delivered for his constituents in Holborn and St Pancras or for the people of Britain. That is simply the reality of it.
And if, let's say, the electorate or his party allow that kind of politics to, you know, for him to get away, or for those people to get away with that type of politics, what does it say about the future of democracy in perhaps the Labour Party, but wider still in terms of democracy in this country and perhaps even the West? Touch upon that, please.
I would argue, and I'm not being hyperbolic here, I would argue that if Keir Starmer stays in office for his whole term until 2029, British democracy will be in the most serious peril it has ever been in. Because I believe that his government is corroding the institutions of our democracy in a systematic and brutal way. And that to save our democracy, we need to get rid of Keir Starmer.
Are you saying he's more dangerous? Sorry to interrupt, but are you saying he's more dangerous than Tony Blair? I mean, he was in...
Absolutely. Look, there are two ways of looking at that. One is globally.
Yeah.
And of course, Tony Blair brought murder and immiseration on the people of Iraq that they still haven't recovered from. But Keir Starmer has been an active participant in an ongoing genocide that has killed tens, if not hundreds of thousands of innocent people. So for the world, even worse, astonishingly. I never thought I'd say that about anyone but Tony Blair. For Britain, you know, Tony Blair didn't get rid of the left in the Labour Party. Jeremy Corbyn was still in the Labour Party under Tony Blair. Keir Starmer has got rid of all of those leftist elements within the party. So what is the difference between the Labour Party, the Lib Dems, the Tories, and I'd argue Reform, who are also an establishment party, even though they try and project themselves as something different? And in order to do that, you cannot do that. You cannot create a situation of such growing inequality in a country without greater repression, which is why we have seen curtailment of the right to protest, which is why Keir Starmer's government wants to do away with jury trials.
Yes.
Because when you are judged by a panel of your peers for protesting a genocide, for protesting climate destruction, those peers are likely to support your actions. So the state has to do away with jury trials. So we've got to get rid of Keir Starmer before those things actually happen. That is the extent to which he is a danger to British democracy and the rule of law in this country.
Do you think, realistically, Keir Starmer, with all the scandals that are engulfing his government and his premiership, almost on a weekly basis now, more and more revelations, more and more U-turns, do you think he can survive the expected evisceration of Labour in the upcoming May local elections?
Absolutely not.
So then those who you referred to that had been purged from the Labour Party by Starmer and McSweeney, and also those on the left, of which there are millions of Britons, not a majority by any stretch of the imagination, but certainly not, you know, a tiny minority. They form a real bulk.
Absolutely.
You see them at the demonstrations, for example, the Palestine demonstrations. You see them taking action in support of Palestine Action, for example. I mean, where would you find 2,000 people that are prepared to get arrested under the Terrorism Act and all the consequences that could have on their lives? Yet we had them and we saw them in central London and across the country. So they are very dedicated activists, volunteers, and those who are from the left of the political spectrum but are not in Labour. What's the vehicle for them? Because we've seen, and you've got experience of this, when they tried to form something in your party, the only thing that kind of united them was to disagree, and disagree ferociously and in public. And sorry for me, someone like myself to say this as an observer and somebody who reports on these matters, it really seemed to take the wind out of the sails of the 800,000 people who'd signed up to support your party, and were left with an almighty mess, if one looks at it objectively. Tell us about where the right vehicle is for them.
So the first thing to say is that I was involved in the early days of your party when it was just an informal group brought together by Jeremy Corbyn discussing the formation of a new left party in Britain. I then inadvertently, along with Jamie Driscoll and Beth Winter, became signatory on a bank account that had no money in it.
Yes.
But then when Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana eventually issued a joint statement saying that they were going to be co-leaders of this new initiative, 800,000 people signed up. And about £800,000 was donated into this bank account that we never thought would have any money, which was an astonishing thing. And it showed the desire for people to see and have a united left.
Yes.
Unfortunately, what bedeviled that initiative is two things that I myself have experienced as a former MP, is what I call parliamentarianism, where people who have spent significant time see Parliament as the centre of the political universe. I don't believe it is, and I'll explain that more in a moment. That's the first thing. And then it's the individualization of politics, where we become fixated on certain individuals. And I understand the need for leadership, obviously. You know, I worked under Nelson Mandela, for goodness sake. If it wasn't for Mandela, we probably wouldn't have transitioned from apartheid. So I completely understand the role of leadership. But at the same time, I think when we vest all of our hope in a few arbitrary individuals, we are creating a disaster for ourselves. And unfortunately, you know, when there were differences and disputes, those landed up being played out publicly. There are always disputes and disagreements in any political formation, but they're usually dealt with behind closed doors, and they're resolved, and then a new unified image can be presented.
Not briefed to the Murdoch press.
Well, exactly. You know, the extraordinary thing was some of the stuff being briefed was being briefed to the very people who had weaponized anti-Semitism against Jeremy Corbyn. Now, whoever did that briefing should hang their heads in shame. To use those people who had effectively destroyed Jeremy as leader of the Labour Party to try and gain sort of any sort of advantage in the Your Party context was unforgivable, in my opinion. So, you know, the reality of Your Party, which I'm not a member of, I never joined up, even though I was involved in those early conversations. The reality of it is that unless it becomes totally democratic, totally grassroots-led, totally transparent, and totally accountable to people at the grassroots, it is going to fail. And that is the choice that the people, because they're electing a central executive committee now.
Yes.
That is going to be the choice that those people are going to have to make, what sort of entity they are creating. And if it fails on those three crucial things, it will die an inglorious death almost before it's got going. Those are the crucial principles that have to inform any vehicle to unify progressive people in this country. And it is a difficult job, because what we need in Britain today is a fundamental change in the structures and functioning of our governance. That is the depth of the crisis we're in, that is what is needed. And the only way you do that, and I can say this from the experience of South Africa, is by combining what I call political victory on the streets, social movements, grassroots politics, with then starting to take power within the palaces of power. But unless those two things are linked, unless those who are elected to represent communities are accountable to those communities, that link will be broken, and it'll never bring fundamental change. It will always be politics as usual. So we need to move beyond just parliamentarianism, first of all, and we need to move beyond the individualization of politics.
You say move on beyond parliamentarianism. So one figure comes straight to mind, and that's the very, very inspirational, I may add, Zach Polanski. He's not a parliamentarian. Yep. He's a London Assembly member. Yet he's taken the Green Party and the Green Movement by storm, and by extension, he appears to be somebody who is a socialist, an avowed socialist. Yep. We're not sure whether, at the moment, you can say the Green Party is a per se socialist party, because its origins are not in socialism. However, he seems to have managed to persuade a lot of those on the left to join his movement, his party, and he seems to be doing very, very well in the polls. Is that an alternative vehicle, I suppose, for those wanting progressive change?
So what has happened is that with Your Party having all of its problems, and of the original 800,000 who signed up, only around 50,000 have actually become members. And I would put that down to the sort of imbroglio that took place for months and months and months. Zach Polanski has very strategically, and as you say, incredibly effectively, taken the gap, if you will, and turned the Greens into what he describes as an eco-socialist party.
And he says populist as well.
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, he's quite right to not be disdainful of the idea of populism. There is nothing wrong with popular politics if they are rooted in the realities of the country and the world at that moment. And I think that the politics that he and the Greens are espousing certainly does that. I think the other thing that we have to give him and the party enormous credit for is their communications, which have been absolutely brilliant. And of course it's an alternative. And so when we talk about the left or progressives generally, you know, to say, oh, everything's a disaster is not true. Because we do have the rise of the Greens under Zach Polanski, but not just under Zach. There is a very interesting leadership team there. You know, there is Zach, there's Rachel Meadows, and there is Motin Ali.
Yes.
And when I look at the leader and the two deputy leaders, I say to myself, that's actually a very impressive and very diverse leadership team.
The sort of thing you were after in your party, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. It's broad-based. It represents the diversity of Britain, which, you know, and it's not just about London, it's about this whole country. What I love so much about it is its diversity. You know, I remember when my son was born in South Africa when I was still an MP, and the media described him as the country's first Muslim, as though this was such an uncommon thing. And then we come to the UK, and in his nursery school, you know, there were almost a dozen other kids who had parentage as diverse as Simone, my wife, and I. And, you know, I love that so much about Britain. I love that so much about South Africa. It is what gives us strength. It is what gives us power as communities and human beings. And the Green Party are really doing an incredibly good job of that. I do think that a big challenge that faces them, and it's a challenge that I hope they meet full on, and that they're certainly very well aware of, is they need to grow the extent of what I would describe as marginalized communities in their membership. And that includes communities of color. The Green Party hasn't historically been a political home for progressive people of color in the United Kingdom. But there is no reason why the party shouldn't be able to grow much further into that space and become a broad political home for all who regard themselves as progressive. And that's an incredibly exciting thing. It's a very exciting thing. So to talk about, you know, the collapse of the left or anything similar is just a nonsense. Because it's not just about your party and its teething troubles. It's also what's happened around the Green Party. It's also what has happened with the social movements that you mentioned earlier. You know, the ability of the Palestine Solidarity Committee, Stop the War, and their various allies to continue to bring tens, hundreds of thousands of people onto the streets of Britain to protest against the direction of this government, against its warmongering abroad, against its active participation in the genocide in Gaza. That's an extraordinary positive. And I think, as you said, you know, there are millions of people in Britain and around the world now who are asking questions about our relationships with Israel that simply weren't being asked 4 years ago.
We're going to go for a very short commercial break. I've got more questions to finish off with in our interview with Andrew. Don't go anywhere. We're going to explore the work that he's doing currently and also his plans for the future. Be right back. Welcome back. I'm with Andrew Feinstein. Andrew, we were speaking about the various movements of the left that could be a vehicle for those who want to challenge the status quo in terms of you know, just poor governance, poor leadership, values, ethics, etc., etc., etc. You were speaking very positively about Zach Polanski and the Green Party. In terms of the broader left movement, whether it's the Greens or whether it's your party or whether some are still choosing to use the Labour Party as a vehicle, do you... I mean, you said that, you know, it would be astonishing if anybody believes that the left has been defeated or beaten. Yeah. And I said there are millions and millions of Britons that support progressive politics. But realistically, for example, in the May elections, how does one position themselves if they're in an area with all three of these combinations? Sure. Who do you support? Where do you go? And is it time for electoral coalitions or pacts, which is what the right is doing, you know, with Reform and Conservative and others?
I think that's a very good point. I think the one group who we need to be explicit about is what you could describe as community independence.
Yes.
As I mentioned, in Camden, we have the Camden People's Alliance, and we'll be contesting the local elections in May. We have very good relationships with the Greens. We're in constant conversation with them. And that's happening in a lot of parts of the country. And I see it as an incredibly positive thing. So what do you do if you have all of these candidates? I would hope that communication between these various groups would result in there being, in every ward, where a ward can elect 3 councillors or 2 councillors or 1 councillor, there will be decisions by these progressive forces to allocate certain wards to be it a party or a community group or whatever the case may be, so that people aren't faced with confusing choices. I think the reality is, unfortunately, at this point in time, the Labour Party is not an option if you describe yourself as progressive. I think we as progressive people need to ensure we don't vote Labour. I think we need to send a very clear message to Keir Starmer and this Labour Party that active participation in a genocide is unacceptable, that policies around growing inequality, growing unemployment, continuing cuts to benefits are all totally unacceptable to us. The only thing that there's money for, according to this government, is war making, because the defence budget increases every year. And he's done that since his first year in office, Keir Starmer, £3.4 billion increase. In fiscal 2027, they're going to increase the defence budget by an additional £15.4 billion. And this is how we link the global to the local. So that is money, some of which will be spent on providing weapons to Israel in Gaza. And it's because of that money that we're seeing local transport routes, the NHS, education, benefits, cut back in ways that the Tories would be proud of. And this is a Labour government, supposedly. So I think Labour are not an option in any way whatsoever. If you're faced with a situation where there hasn't been agreement between progressive groups, then you've got to make your choice. And you've got to be clear what your lines in the sand are, what your red lines are. For instance, there's a brilliant Vote Palestine campaign, which is asking candidates to sign a pledge in relation to Palestine and their support for Palestine. I would say that's a non-negotiable. If a candidate hasn't signed that, you shouldn't vote for them, because if you can't pledge as a councillor to ensure that your local council stops investing in a genocide in Gaza, then I don't know how you would call yourself progressive, first of all. Second of all, you've got to look at individuals, and you've got to ask individuals explicitly to commit themselves to being transparent and accountable, to being proper representatives. But I'm really hopeful that in the vast majority of areas around the country, there will be agreements in place, formal and or informal, between the various progressive groupings, so that there will be very clear progressive candidates commensurate with the number of councillors who can be elected in that ward. The final thing I would say is, quite obviously, where there is the option of reform, we have to oppose this racism everywhere. This I do not believe Nigel Farage will be the next Prime Minister of Britain. We're already seeing reforms polling starting to go down a bit. The sorts of people they put up as candidates are just really horrendous people. I debated against one at the Cambridge University Debating Union just a few weeks ago, their candidate for the upcoming Gorton and Denton by-election. And a combination of ignorance and arrogance that is just horrible, absolutely horrible, that I hope won't appeal to the voters of Gorton and Denton, who have, in this instance, a really brilliant local Green candidate. Both the May election and the next general election are going to be existential elections in British history. They're going to determine the future of our democracy and whether our democracy has a future.
Quite a powerful statement, that is.
This is how bad it's got. This is what Starmer's government has done to this country. They are trying to destroy freedom of protest, freedom of speech, freedom of the media, freedom to support the people of Palestine effectively. They want to curb protest against themselves. They have been investigating journalists, including my colleague Paul Holden and myself, who have been revealing their misconduct, their financial irregularities and possible criminal conduct. They have had us investigated. They've spied on us. A democratic government doesn't behave in this way. This is the way Richard Nixon behaved, and he was impeached because of Watergate. And this is the way someone who claims to have been a human rights lawyer is conducting himself in office. It's shameful. But more important than that, it is a very real threat to our democracy. And when people go to the polls in May, they need to understand that. And they need to weigh up which candidate is going to, first of all, represent them properly, and second of all, is going to fight for our democratic values.
Andrew, you're writing a book, the title of which is quite compelling. Tell us about that.
So we're doing, and when I say we, I work with this incredible team at Shadow World Investigations. And it's the first time I'm writing a book with 4 other people. So there are 5 of us writing it. I'm responsible for the final narrative product, and it's challenging because my 4 colleagues are all absolutely brilliant, but all write in different styles. We've been investigating the wars in Gaza and in Yemen, and the book is called Making a Killing: How the West Profits from Slaughter in Gaza and Yemen. It is shameful how much money is being made by defense companies, by the so-called defense tech companies, how much money is being made by individuals, including people like Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, both of whom have family roots in apartheid South Africa and seem to be living out some sort of appalling racist worldview. And of course, all of these people are responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands, for the immiseration of millions in Gaza and Yemen. And underpinning it all, in my opinion, is obviously geopolitics, where Israel plays the role of the West's representative almost in the Middle East, which is an absurdity in and of itself. Money. The trade in weapons is the most corrupt trade the world has ever known, accounting for 40% of all corruption in world trade. And a lot of that corruption finds its way back into our political parties and into the hands of our politicians. Tony Blair has made himself personally in excess of 110 million out of his involvement with corrupt British arms companies like BAE Systems and Rolls-Royce. And then, and I don't say this lightly, being a South African, being someone who was privileged by an apartheid system and who then had the honor of playing a very tiny role in the struggle against it and in our first democratic governments. Underpinning all of this is a racist white supremacy. And we see that in the difference in reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which in my opinion was an illegal invasion and is an illegal invasion, and the war crimes and genocide that Israel is committing in Gaza. And so the book draws out these parallels, but it focuses on those who are responsible. And part of what we want to do in the book is not only make people around the world aware of this and aware of these individuals, companies, countries who are responsible for what has been going on, but to actually seek justice for what has happened. So in addition to the book, we're going to have a website with extraordinarily detailed information on it that we couldn't fit in the book because the book would have turned into a tome of multiple books.
Sure.
That'll have information on all of those who have profited. And our hope, and we will certainly be encouraging this around the world, is that relevant authorities, but also brilliant human rights lawyers, lawyers of international law, will start taking cases against these institutions and these people all over the world. Because unless people face justice for Gaza and Yemen, the rule of law in our countries and across the globe is no more.
I know, Andrew, you didn't mention the media. You mentioned lawyers.
Yeah.
And you mentioned ordinary people as well. Is that because you believe fundamentally that the media is either incapable of doing the work that they are meant to do, holding power to account? Or is it because the media itself now is gone beyond doing its duties and it's completely compromised? Which of the two is that?
The media is completely compromised. You know, the thing that is most scary for us in the research that we've been doing for this book over a number of years now is many of the same financial institutions that own controlling stakes in the world's defense companies and defense tech companies own most of the world's mainstream media. Over 50% of legacy, traditional media, is owned by these same billionaires. 9 of the 10 most popular social media platforms in the world are owned by these billionaires. So they are espousing the appalling message of their owners. Sometimes they're doing that explicitly. Sometimes they're doing it by omission. I would strongly recommend Peter Oborne's brilliant book on the British media's complicity in the genocide. It's a book called Complicity, and it covers this issue of the media's role in all of this. The media's role is to speak truth to power. The traditional media no longer speaks truth, and it is part of power now. And it's one of the key reasons why I argue we have the best democracy money can buy. Because the erosion of the media, which, you know, I worked with extraordinary media outlets and incredible investigations of corrupt British companies and individuals, and that work just doesn't happen in the legacy media anymore. But at the same time, because I'm not one to think that the world is now all darkness, I believe one has to look at the positives. And the positive of this is the rise of alternative media. And if we just look in Britain today, this channel, I was mentioned once in the legacy media when I was taking on the Prime Minister. And that one mention was that I was a radical activist. No mention of the fact that I had been a South African MP, that I'd served under Nelson Mandela, that I spent 25 years addressing political corruption, because that would have been inconvenient. So, you know, channels like this, which I've really so enjoyed being interviewed on many times over the years now, Novara Media, Declassified UK, which is brilliant on British foreign policy and defence and intelligence. The Canary. There are so many. Double Down News. You know, there are just so many. 5 Pillars. There are numerous. And these are the places where there is an attempt to hold truth to power. And that is what the media should do. It's his responsibility to do. It's what each of us as active citizens should do. Because the way out of the morass that we find ourselves in, a morass of inequality, of massive deviance in the behavior of our political and economic elite, a morass of forever wars that become more and more brutal, usually against people of color. The way out of this morass is for us to take back our democracies and for us to stand up for our self-appointed leaders. So that if you happen to be in an area where none of the progressive entities that we've been speaking about are standing, get together as a community and get one amongst yourselves to stand. That's what we did in Holborn and St Pancras. And Keir Starmer became the first person in British electoral history to enter number 10 Downing Street without increasing his own personal vote, let alone the reality that his own personal vote collapsed by 50% in his own constituency. He will never stand again for office because he knows that if he did, he would be so thoroughly beaten in his own constituency that it would be mortifying for him, and it would be a reflection how even his own constituency feels about his time in office. And that was done not by me, that was done by the community of Camden. And I have to say, people from around the UK and outside the UK. We had people coming from Dubai, from Ireland, from the US, from Egypt, to volunteer for the campaign. And the best thing about that campaign was how it brought all of these people together. And initially, they probably came together in a united hatred of Keir Starmer. But I like to think by the end of the campaign, and it was only a 6-week campaign because, of course, there was a rushed election that was announced the day after I announced. We thought we had 6 months. But by the end of the election, after we knocked on over 52,000 doors in the constituency, I think most people realized they'd volunteered, not because of their hatred of Starmer and his policies, but because of the hope that the campaign offered, because of the celebration of the diversity of Camden, of London, and of Britain, and the fact that all our communities actually do live together in remarkable harmony. And as I travel around the country, and I do about 25,000 miles a year, traveling around the UK, giving talks and screenings of films and book events, etc., Britain remains an extraordinary place where, you know, I've been at events where people of every description are sat, of so many different political views, and we can all talk about these things. And ultimately, that is the way we're going to resolve and do what is best for our communities locally and nationally and globally. And I'm a great believer, because of my experience in South Africa, where we won a liberation struggle, not without massive challenges post that victory, but where we won a liberation struggle. I am a huge believer in the power of all of us ordinary people coming together to change history. And that is what Britain needs today.
Well, Andrew, on that remarkably sanguine and at times very poignant reflection, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for this episode, for certainly. I'm hoping I'll see you again soon, very shortly, perhaps, to give us more of an update in terms of what's been taking place, and certainly just to reflect on what takes place in May. Folks, I think I hope you found it as fascinating as I did, and also insightful and also hopeful as well, because as Andrew said, it's not all doom and gloom. There are so many countercurrents to all the doom and gloom that is taking place, to provide some hope, certainly in terms of geopolitics, but also in terms of politics in this country, which, as he's very skillfully and oratorially said, you know, there's a lot people can do. I'm afraid we've come to the end of the interview. I had a whole series of extra questions to ask him, but sadly time is against us. But hopefully he'll join us, and please do stay tuned in. I'm doing a lot of these interviews up until the election in May. Hopefully my series about meeting the independents, you've seen a few of the episodes, and I will be going around the country to find out what the countercurrents are and what they say. We've had Motin Ali as well interviewed, and obviously today we've had none other than Andrew Feinstein. So thank you for joining me, and I'll see you all again very soon.